Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at a pair of cavalry pistols, a World War I nursing sister's medals and luggage, and a pair of aviation goggles from World War II. Mark looks at a pair of flight goggles and a pilot's log used in World War II.
And the losses in this particular bomber command were 55,000, and it was probably even worse than being out in the Atlantic Ocean in the Navy. There was a certain amount of fortitude and a certain amount of grit to get through all this.
Gary looks at matron Laura May Hubley's service medals and luggage.
I think sometimes when people consider the Great Wars, they see officers and they see sometimes privates, but they don't see women.
Kevin looks at a pair of Italian pistols recovered during the First World War.
At the end of it, like so many of the empires of Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire basically collapses by the latter part of the war and into the 1920s. It doesn't really exist anymore.
My name is Dusan Sudek. I'm a retired family physician, and I live in Halifax, but I was born and partially raised in Europe, in the Czech Republic. I brought two pistols. They've been in my family for over a century, and they've been on my parents' living room wall for many, many years, and they passed away. Now they're in my living room wall.
Following the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which partially reinstated Hungary with the Austrian Empire, the newly formed and politically divided Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy shared three things: their ruler, foreign policy, and military. The 1914 assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, then heir to the Austrian throne, sparked a series of political and military moves by the Austrian Empire, supported by Germany against Serbia, events which marked the beginning of World War I. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered many defeats, with a notable instance being the Second Battle of Piave in June 1918 between Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces, in which control of the Monte Grappa, a strategic Italian position, was sought but never achieved. The war ended on November 11, 1918, 5 months following the failed seizure of Piave.
Good morning, Doctor. Thanks for joining us. I was wondering if you could tell us what it is you've brought in this morning.
Well, these two pistols, they've been in my family for just over a century. My late grandfather brought them from Italy. He was an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I.
His grandfather fought, being born in Bohemia. He fought in the Austrian-Hungarian army. Much of the war is literally fought in the Austrian-Italian Alps.
I'm curious about how old are they? Obviously, they're quite old, but there's no marks that I could see. I have no idea who made them, when.
Well, these pistols are cavalry pistols. These were made in Italy at some point in the late 17th, very early 18th century. Okay, so these are quite rare to see on this side of the Atlantic. These could have been acquired literally someplace they stopped overnight or something like that, place that had been bombed out or whatever. People often pick things up that are in deserted areas. But these are indeed 17th century Italian cavalry pistols. They're really quite remarkable. I've never seen Italian pistols of that age here in Canada. Those, again, they're like late 17th, early 18th century. Again, the amount of artistry that's on them and the fact that they're here is quite extraordinary. And these, again, aren't necessarily issued just to regular troopers. This is kind of almost like an officer's grade sidearm. So again, the amazing amount of brass finial work and whatnot that's on here. These are quite kind of a signature of the Italian pistols of this time period, the style of butt. You'll see this, though, with this guard. This becomes quite common in cavalry pistols all over the Western world. This, though, has, what's really interesting on this one, has what they call a little esturgeon plate here, again, which is very ornate, very nice. And again, the sort of One of the diagnostic elements of this as being a late 17th, early 18th century is this small hook that you see here on the trigger and up here on the cock. But again, these are remarkably good shape, and if you gave them a little bit of a clean, you might be able to find underneath like the name of maybe who made them. But again, these are really quite extraordinary. And you have the original pipes or ramrods, which is rather rare for something this old. So they're an extraordinary piece of sort of history. And again, quite rare for this side of the Atlantic, especially in Eastern Canada. You don't see a lot of Italian flintlock pistols over here.
Could you explain the function of the ramrod? That's to stick the bullet in?
The ramrod, these would have, by this time, you have like, you can do what they call loose loading. So this is the frizzen. So you put a small amount of charge in here. Makes a nice big vent there. That would go down. This would be pulled back on full cock. When that's fired, the cock comes forward. There'd be a piece of flint in here. That strikes the frizzen. The spark goes into the pan. That spark goes in the vent right here, and then you have a discharge. There used to be an expression you'd hear, don't go off half-cocked.
Right, okay.
This is like in a half-cock position here now, so it's almost like a safety.
Right, okay.
So sometimes if people were kind of excited and they pull the trigger, you go off half-cocked, you're not going to get a real good ignition on that because the energy just isn't there from
and of course,
coming up.
if it's raining, there'll be no ignition.
The Cav always has its sabers as well, right?
Yes, yeah. How fast could a well-trained trooper reload?
3 rounds a minute is like often prescribed to a flintlock musket, okay? This is much harder though if you're, like you were saying, on horseback.
Yeah,
okay? Yeah, so once these things would be discharged, you'd have to be able to be somewhat disengaged, because if you're going to fire these things, that means you have to get really in close with your opponent.
Yeah.
So with that, there's usually like they pass in, they fire their weapons first, then they'll kind of wheel around. Those things would go back in the buckets, and then you'd come back at them with your saber.
And until today, they haven't been moved for a long time. And of course, I've never fired them. I wouldn't dare.
No. And this gives you, though, I'm sure, then within your family, a direct link to the grandfather no one had the chance to meet, eh?
Yes, that's correct, yeah. As an officer, he was a lieutenant when he started, and he finished the war as a second lieutenant. And as an officer, he needed his commanding officer's permission to get married. In May 1918, he got finally permission to marry his fiancée, my grandmother, and he came home with this trunk full of items that he collected during the war. And these guns are part of it, you know. So he got married, and meanwhile, his unit, the 2nd Battalion of the 21st Regiment, was totally demolished by the Italians at the Second Battle of the Piave. So basically, that leave probably saved his life.
No doubt, no doubt. Thank you so much for bringing these in. I'm just curious, what do you think is the fate of these? These are no doubt stay in the family for another couple of 100 years, no doubt, eh?
Well, very much so. They're keepers. They're not to be disposed of.
Exactly.
And luckily, my son has a interest in history also. They'll be his, probably long before I die.
Oh, good.
So they'll be in good hands.
If you'd ever like to bring these to the museum, we could give them a light cleaning with some conservator's wax, which would might expose like some maker's marks and who might have made them, fill in the story a little more, but also just give you a nice cover to keep them on there.
Yeah.
Be happy to do that for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's
my pleasure.
That's a wonderful offer, and I'll certainly take you up on it.
It was a real treat as a curator to see some of those and hold them up close and to meet the doctor and hear his story.
Very interesting. Yes, I learned quite a bit, the details of the actual guns. And yes, and I really appreciate the offer of having it, stabilized and conserved. So hopefully it'll look better and it'll survive another century in the family, at least.
Coming up on Militaria.
I think sometimes when people consider the Great Wars, they see officers, but they don't see women. My name is Shara Kingston, and I am the collections manager for the Army Museum. And today I brought in Laura May Hubley's medals and luggage. She was a nursing sister in the First World War.
Of the 424,000 Canadians who travelled overseas to fight in World War I, 2,845 served as nursing sisters. Originally part of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, the nursing sisters arrived in Europe as members of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, responsible for providing medical support services. These women risked their lives to provide treatment and care to sick and injured Army personnel. Stationed in field hospitals, casualty clearing stations, and transport ships across England, France, Belgium, Russia, and the Mediterranean, their vital role continued long after the war in rehabilitation centres and military camps ravaged by disease. A total of 58 nursing sisters perished in the Great War. Their contributions and sacrifices are memorialised on Parliament Hill in the Centre Block's Hall of Honour.
Welcome to Militaria, Shara. And could you tell me what you brought from the Army Museum today?
Sure. So I brought some artifacts from matron Laura Hubley. So the items that I brought were her medal group, her nurses, or what I would call a doctor's bag, and a civilian suitcase that was given to her by her nurses.
On this case, we've got the tag, and the tag is from her trip to Vimy in 1936 as part of the Vimy pilgrimage.
So this is a real beauty. It's a civilian suitcase, but her nurses purchased it for her as a gift. There's a dedication on the inside, as well as all the bits that she would need to travel with. So she would have brought this over with her to England and then France for the Vimy pilgrimage.
Inside, we have the contents that she would have used
Right.
for her personal traveling. So it's, again, it is just a suitcase, but it's not just a
But
suitcase.
it's not, yeah.
Because it has quite an interesting historical significance when you tie the Vimy pilgrimages, because I can't imagine there was a lot of women that went over to that. So Matron Hubley was part of the Permanent Army Medical Corps when she decided to transfer to the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The Canadian Expeditionary Force was the army that was raised during the First World War to fight overseas. So if you were serving in the army when the First World War broke out, in order to get overseas, you had to get permission to leave your unit, join this Canadian Expeditionary Force, and then you went overseas. So Shara, how did the museum receive these artifacts?
Well, about 7 years ago, her great-nephew approached us to bring the lot that belonging to her, and we were so happy to receive it. But it was in the family's heirlooms up in the attic, and they weren't quite sure how to proceed with them.
It's a good story because it's, of course, a woman and her wartime accomplishments. I believe that the nurses had to be single in order to join because they didn't want the frail female form worried about their husbands back in Canada or possibly at the front. So they wanted a woman that was focused on what they were doing, and that was nursing, and that was it, nursing. And I believe this was not unusual at the time. I believe there were some hospitals that to be a nurse, you had to be single. It was, again, it was a sign of the time. If you were working as a woman, your whole job was the job. You weren't looking after a household, you weren't looking after a man, you weren't looking after kids. And I believe that's the whole reason behind it.
So these are all the items that were inside her case. There's this beautiful cigarette case that was given to her. It has a dedication on the front, presented to Nursing Sister Laura May Hubley, RRC, which references the medal she received, by the Officers and Headquarters Military District Number 1. And the date is London, June 24th, 1934. Just a beautiful wooden and silver case.
And of course, that's London, Ontario, not London, England, because yeah, that's where Military District Number 1 was headquartered. So Shara, what are you going to have to do to this lot to get it to a point where it's stable enough to be put on exhibit?
I think our medical bag is close. It would get a leather treatment, which is just a conditioning that most people would do with their boots or something like that. So that's ready to go. The concern is the metal grouping. They were not mounted, which is this portion here that gets put on when we received them. So we would want to make sure we mounted them so that they could be presented properly and in the right order. And then this bag here, we want to figure out a way that we can open it. Currently, as you can see, we can't open it without it flopping over. And inside is where her nursing sisters put a dedication. And so we need to sort of work on a way to do that so that that can be open so we can show the items inside and make a little vignette. I think sometimes when people consider the Great Wars, as well as even Afghanistan, though we are getting more women's stories in there, they see officers and they see sometimes privates and other ranks, but they don't see women. And the nursing story is starting to come out. I think a lot of groups have done some great research and exposure on that. But for me, that's the heart. If you're injured, you want to be cared for. And that's in part what they did. They cared. And I love that aspect of their story.
So thank you so much for bringing in these wonderful artifacts from the Army Museum. I think it's a great story, and it's one that's I think is really good to share with people.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
My thoughts in today's piece are that I think it's a very interesting grouping. To me, it's an important grouping because it's a grouping about a woman. And we don't have a lot of material from women, especially early women. And I know the First World War is not early in the great time frame of life, but it is, especially when it comes to women, because there were some nursing sisters that went to South Africa, but not very many. It wasn't really until the First World War that you start seeing women, and women weren't a part of the Army until the Second World War.
Coming up on Militaria.
The losses in this particular bomber command were 55,000, and it was probably even worse than being out in the Atlantic Ocean in the Navy.
My name is John Graham, and today I have brought in my father's aviator goggles and his logbook, and I've also brought in a photograph of my father taken when he initially joined the RCAF, I believe in 1939.
Canada's Air Force service history began as part of England's Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. Established in 1920, the Canadian Air Force was renamed the Royal Canadian Air Force by royal decree from King George V in 1924. After being plagued with poor enlistment numbers, the RCAF regrouped in 1939. They deployed a total of 250,000 service members during the Second World War, and, as the fourth largest Allied air force, accounted for 1/3 of Britain's perilous Bomber Command aircrew. With a casualty rate of 44%, it was widely understood that no matter where you were in the world, Bomber Command was always the most dangerous place to be. The constant threat claimed 17,101 lives, but the legacy of Royal Canadian Air Force aircrews was cemented by the Allied victory they helped achieve.
I'd like to welcome John to the set today. This is an interesting collection of items and relates to your father's RCF wartime career.
That's right, yeah. So these are my dad's goggles and his air gunner badge, and also his logbook.
And we also have actually the original box that the goggles came in, and we've got a picture of your father there, John. And there's a cleaning kit inside there as well for your keeping care of your goggles, and it was all part of the equipment. This is very rare to see the actual box of the actual came in that, and also the condition of these goggles is a highlight to the collection.
He joined the RCAF when he was about 17 or perhaps 18, and flew with number 6 Group RCAF in England as a air gunner.
We've got his air gunner badge, which will denote that he was titled, which you see AG on it, would mean that he flew air gunner operations in a power-operated turret. In this case, he flew on mainly Halifax bombers. And we have the RCF cap badge, and we also have his logbook. With an air gunner, it's a little different than a pilot's logbook. It relates still to the same aircraft. It relates to the aircraft he flew on and what particular time was on it, what the mission did. That's all included in here as well. And it's an interesting chronology of the dates and the time that we see throughout the course of operations. And in this case, this is mainly training. training to become an air gunner in a RAF or RCF bomber. In his particular case, he flew in Halifax bombers. The mid-upper turret was a central part of the aircraft. He would have had command of 4 Browning 303 machine guns, and he would be responsible to protect that bomber on its roughly 4-hour mission across Europe. And he was part of that crew, and that crew was trained to be a unit. And you can look at his logbook, it shows a lot of training with the various heavy conversion units, and that was where they crewed up the crews to make them a fighting unit so they could all operate. So when the 7 crew members went across Europe in their bombers, they knew exactly what they had to do and what was expected of them. So your father, John, he had a full war. I mean, there's no question about it. Even though he didn't operationally do missions to some degree, it was essentially a training operation. But he was actually in Gander at one point, which at that point was part of the British Empire. It wasn't part of Canada. And Gander was a frontline airbase at that point, fighting the Atlantic War. Aircraft were starting to be moved through to Europe. It was actually the crossroads at that point, a significant airbase at that point.
So you're right, it was training, but I asked as a small boy, I said, did you ever see an enemy aircraft? And he said yes. He said there was a twin-engined aircraft, and it was floating around at the edge. And I was like, did you shoot at them? Being a sort of a wide-eyed, thinking that you're going to wait till you see the whites of their eyes and then shoot at them. And my dad said, oh no, we did shoot at him. And I was like, did you hit him? My dad was like, oh no, he was miles out of range. And I was like, well, why would you shoot at him? And Dad said to let him know that we were awake.
John's father's career was interesting because it was pretty varied, but it encompassed most of the war. He really had 2 separate wars. He had a war in Canada, then was trained and then was sent to England to work and operate within RCF 6 group. And he did a lot of training, and I think that's probably what enabled him to survive. 55,000 crewmen were lost.
He's a lucky man, I think, because if he had been aircrew in 1939 and become a gunner, I don't think he would have survived. I did learn some new things about the artifacts, and perhaps about the use, like my father's career and his activity as an air gunner and how the air gunners would coordinate in defending the aircraft. That was very useful and new. I'm hoping to do some more research. It would be nice to find out some more. And for the artifacts, I guess we're going to have to think about perhaps donating them, to a museum. Maybe yours. We'll see.
Well, we'd certainly appreciate a great collection like this at some point down the road, but obviously it's your collection to do what you want with it, and it tells the story of the Graham family, and again, that's something that you don't see every day, and I guess that's the treasure you get to give on to your daughter and to your family and your son to actually part what they've been part of.
I think it was wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about my dad's stuff, and I really enjoyed being here and talking about my dad and about his career and the things he did in the war.